Hey everyone, this is a piece by Karl Korsch. It's from 1927. It's from 10 year. It's titled 10 Years of Class Struggles in Soviet Russia. I'm getting this from the German section of Marxist.org. So I am using a translator on this, so some of it might not be, the translations might not be super precise. But I think it's enough to get the party going. And starts with a quote. Quote, "What succumbed to these defeats was not the revolution. It was the pre-revolutionary traditional appendages, the results of social conditions that had not yet developed into sharp class conflicts. People, illusions, ideas, projects from which the Revolutionary Party was not free before the February Revolution, from which it could not be freed by the February victory, but only by a series of defeats. In a word, revolutionary progress did not break through in its immediate tragicomic achievements, but rather in the creation of a coherent, powerful counter-revolution, in the creation of an opponent through whose struggle the Revolutionary Party only matured into a truly revolutionary party." End quote. Marx, Class Struggles in France. In the roaring songs of triumph that are being heard today in Soviet Russia and throughout the world to celebrate the 10th anniversary of the victorious October Revolution, the 10th anniversary of the existence of the Socialist Soviet Union, there is a disturbing and annoying discordant note, the factional struggle, which is currently reaching boiling point between the ruling Stalin coalition and the Trotskyist Zinovьevist left opposition within the Bolshevik ruling party. Here is Lenin's Bolshevik Central Committee against petty bourgeois, Menshevik, social democratic deviations! Here is orthodox revolutionary Leninism against Thermidorian degeneration! What is hidden behind these two fine-sounding slogans? Which of these two trends, which despite their many, quote, pacifist and, quote, capitulatory tendencies, are repeatedly driven into sharp, irreconcilable political conflict against each other as if by an invisible, irresistible force, can today claim to have the genuine ring of the Bolshevik Leninist tradition in its hands and to appear before the Russian and the entire international working class as the real successors to that revolutionary proletarian class policy which led to the glorious October. It is an extremely vulgar primitivism and the exact opposite of the materialistic critical method used by Karl Marx when some contemporary, quote, Marxists and, quote, revolutionaries answer this question by saying that this entire current factional struggle within the Bolshevik Party is essentially nothing more than a personal power struggle between ambitious cliques of leaders. For these, quote, Marxists, Karl Marx wrote his Class Struggles in France and his 18th Brumaire of Louis Bonaparte for nothing, and showed for nothing how the application of his materialistic method to current contemporary history consists precisely in tracing all, quote, political conflicts, including the most ordinary disputes between the various political groupings of a parliament, a government, a governing or opposition party, quote, to the struggles of interest of the social classes and class fractions given by economic development, and in demonstrating that the individual political parties are the more or less adequate corresponding political expression of these same classes and class fractions. End quote. Marx, Friedrich Engels, Introduction to Marx's Class Struggles in France. Marx has repeatedly pointed out in vain that for this materialist view of historical events, what matters much less is what the individuals involved, and even more so whole cliques and parties, quote, think and say about themselves, end quote. than the material interests hidden behind these phrases and imaginations. Behind all these, quote, old memories, personal enmities, fears and hopes, prejudices and illusions, sympathies and antipathies, convictions, articles of faith and principles, end quote. Marx, the 18th Brumaire of the Wee Part. And the social classes and class fractions that stand up and fight for these interests. And the class fractions that stand up and fight for these interests. All of Marx's teachings on the real materialist method do not exist for our primitivists. They stubbornly repeat their trivial wisdom that Zinoviev and Trotsky, quote, are no better than Stalin, end quote, and that therefore the whole squabble between them is of no consequence to the Russian proletariat, oppressed and exploited by the Russian new economic policy bourgeoisie and bureaucracy, and more so to the international proletariat. It is easy to see that this apparently very radical and revolutionary attitude to the development of the Russian Soviet Union in general, and to the current factional struggles within the Bolshevik ruling party in particular, is in essence just as, quote, abstract and, quote, idealistic a view of Russian affairs as its apparent opposite, the official, quote, Leninist legend about the, quote, construction of socialism in Soviet Russia, end quote, that began with the October victory of 1917 and the transition to the new economic policy in 1921. Both describe the essential feature of the historical and social development of the, quote, new Russia since 1917, not as struggle, but as, quote, construction. Some do not want to see or accept anything other than the construction of an alleged, quote, socialism in a country of the victorious proletarian revolution. Others, on the other hand, see in the developments of the last 10 or 7 years nothing but the triumph of the bourgeois counter-revolution on the back of a proletariat mentally and physically paralyzed by 100% fraud and open violence. In other words, nothing but the, quote, construction or, quote, reconstruction and, quote, expansion of capitalism, so to speak. The alleged, quote, Marxism of both the one and the other consists in the fact that they do not see in this most immediate, most important part of world history, or at least do not see it in its concrete form, what, according to the teachings of Marx and Engels, forms the only real content of all history, the class struggles, and especially the struggle of the proletariat. The only, quote, really revolutionary class in the present epoch of developed capitalist society. For some, there were class struggles in Russia before October 1917, and thus a real history, but since October 1917, there has, quote, no longer been, end quote, history, or real history. For others, there is, quote, not yet again, end quote, a real class struggle of the proletariat in present-day Russia. What is happening today and in the last 10 or 7 years of the reconstruction of the capitalist economy and society in Soviet Russia is for them only passive suffering, oppression, and exploitation, but not yet a reawakened class struggle of the Russian proletariat, even if it is still often unconscious or conducted with a false consciousness. In contrast to these two shallow and false views, a truly Marxist, that is, critical materialist conception of the social development triggered by the October Revolution of 1917, that is, critical materialist conception of the social development triggered by the October Revolution of 1917, and in particular the present and all previous factional struggles in the Communist Party Soviet Union, must start from the view of the, quote, 10 years of Soviet Russia, end quote, as a period of new and novel class struggles. A period of new and novel class struggles. The victorious October Revolution of 1917, in connection with the entire international situation created by the temporary conclusion of the First Imperialist War of 1914 to 1918, confronted the working class in the newly created Soviet Russian community and at the same time the entire international proletariat with an enormous number of enormously difficult, extremely new, and hitherto completely unheard of class tasks. I'm going to repeat that sentence because it's full of italics. The victorious October Revolution of 1917, in connection with the entire international situation created by the temporary conclusion of the First Imperialist War of 1914 to 1918, confronted the working class in the newly created Soviet Russian community, and at the same time the entire international proletariat with an enormous number of enormously difficult, extremely new, and hitherto completely unheard of tasks. At the time, it opened up a period of equally new and unheard of class struggles, now lasting for 10 years, partly between the proletariat in Russia, which has triumphed for a moment in world history, and the reactionary bourgeoisie of the whole world, which is preparing for an open hostile counterattack, and partly between the various directions and currents within the Russian and international working class itself, which are at odds to the point of absolute antagonism over the aims and paths of the proletariat in this new period of struggle, starting with those which are in conflict with each other in their aims and methods of struggle, did not want to go beyond the framework of a bourgeois peasant revolution in Russia in this period, ending with those who wanted to continue the revolutionary action of the international proletariat begun in Russia in one go and in an uninterrupted progressive expansion and a deepening as a, quote, revolution in permanence, under the absolute completion of the proletarian world revolution, in between a mass of mediating tendencies combined in various ways and changing their positions in many ways over time. The special feature of this period of new class struggles, initiated by the October Revolution, is that it was the first time in history that a fairly permanent and solid victory of the proletariat was achieved, even if initially only in one country. This did not change the basic relationship between, quote, reform and revolution, as defined by Marxism, as Lenin himself always maintained, at least in theory, even at a time when he had already taken a different path in practice. Even at a time when Lenin had already taken a different path in practice. Parenthesis, see in particular Lenin's cautious formulations in his commemorative speech on the 4th anniversary of the Soviet Union, on the importance of gold now and after the complete victory of socialism. On the importance of gold now and after the complete victory of socialism. One second. Okay, I just wanted to see. I don't know. I was curious if this could be the importance of money and now and after the complete victory of socialism. But I think it is actually gold. Thus, especially that speech from Lenin was from Pravda, November 22nd, 1922. Thus, especially under the dictatorship limited to one country, and to purely backward Russia at that, which was the pure product of a real proletarian socialist revolution. But certainly not the product of a, quote, pure proletarian revolution. The necessity of continuing the class struggle, that is, the revolutionary class struggle, not only on an international scale, but also for the Russian proletariat, will remain unchanged. But this revolutionary proletarian class struggle inevitably had to undergo a major change in its form in the state of the proletarian dictatorship. Parenthesis, no matter how disgusting the class treasonous desecration of the idea of the proletarian dictatorship by today's Leninist statesmen may be, it must not deter us, the followers of Marx's doctrine of the revolutionary proletarian class dictatorship, from the unreserved recognition of this necessity. End parenthesis. I don't know if I said parenthesis at the beginning, but anyway. State repression against the hitherto ruling domestic bourgeoisie, external defensive wars against the hostile capitalist environment are in Soviet Russia and will be added to the previous, more direct forms of class struggle in every future state of proletarian conquest of power, and will partially replace them. Understood in this way, no revolutionary Marxist fundamentally disputes the temporary necessity of, quote, socialist defense of the fatherland, end quote, and the revolutionary expediency of, quote, red intervention abroad and, quote, red terror at home, which may be given under certain circumstances. However, the particular emphasis placed on this by the Russian Bolsheviks and their overly Bolshevized followers in the non-Russian section of the Comintern is one of those, quote, disservices that, according to a good saying by Rosa Luxemburg, are rendered to international socialism by those who, quote, want to enter into its repositories as new knowledge of all the crookedness introduced into Russia by necessity and coercion, which in the end were only emanations of the bankruptcy of international socialism in the World War, end quote. Rosa Luxemburg, The Russian Revolution. But of course, at least for every Marxist, despite all these new organizational forms of class struggle, under the conditions of the proletarian dictatorship, in a country in which classes and class antagonisms are rooted in the economic structure of society, the real basis of the entire new state system continue to exist. The continuation of the direct class struggle of the workers in the old, quote, revolutionary form is an absolute necessity that cannot be fantasized away by decrees or new, quote, theories, and that always breaks through with elemental force in the face of all repressions arising from material development. I'm going to repeat that last bit. The continuation of the direct class struggle of the workers in the old, quote, revolutionary form is an absolute necessity that cannot be fantasized away by any decrees or new, quote, theories, and that always breaks through with elemental force in the face of all repressions arising from material development. Thus, it is precisely through the revolutionary conquest of power, through the establishment of the proletarian dictatorship in the new Russian Soviet state, that tremendous new contradiction arises in which the entire international proletariat, found itself entangled after the Red October of 1917, and for whose Marxist class-based proletarian revolutionary solution, the Russian proletariat, and at the same time, unfortunately only to an all too small extent, and with all too little strength after the early death of the one and only Rosa Luxemburg, the vanguard of the international proletariat have struggled since then theoretically and practically. From this contradiction arise all the manifold political conflicts and struggles over direction, which broke out in the new Soviet state created by the October Revolution, and especially within the Bolshevik Party, which governs this state from the very first moment, from the very hour of the birth of the Soviet state, so to speak, and which have continued uninterruptedly throughout the 10-year period since then, with intensity which has changed at times and has increased rapidly in recent years, up to the present day. On the one side of these incessant struggles are those who either, as the current opposition leader Trotsky did with particular vehemence for a certain period, around 1920, consider any further continuation of the direct class struggle to be superfluous and harmful, or else, in accordance with Lenin's practice, want to limit this struggle at least to forms which fundamentally remain on the basis of this Soviet state, achieved by revolution, and within the framework of the, quote, state necessities, end quote, imposed by its existence. See, for example, Lenin's, quote, mediation position in the trade union debate at the end of 1920, beginning of 1921, where, in contrast to Trotsky's position at the time, Lenin acknowledged the workers' trade union struggles for wages and other working conditions as permissible and necessary even in the revolutionary, quote, workers' state, but declared all demands of the then, quote, workers' opposition, of Shliapnikov, and comrades that went beyond this to be a, quote, syndicalist and anarchist deviant, end quote, that was incompatible with membership of the ruling Communist Party and whose propaganda was inadmissible in the state of the proletarian dictatorship, end parenthesis. Where am I? These representatives of the alleged or real, quote, revolutionary state needs, end quote, in the new, increasingly consolidated and, quote, developing, and by no means, quote, dying away, dictatorship, are opposed from the other side by the repeated advances over the course of these 10 years, despite all attempts at suppression, of those who, in one form or another, with more or less clear awareness, often at first quite unconsciously or with a false awareness, and up to the present day still in the most inconsistent way, represent the immediate needs and interests of the proletarian class, which are newly and originally arising from material development. State necessities versus proletarian class necessities. State necessities versus proletarian class necessities. This is the objective contradiction in this new revolution of the 20th century, where the proletarian class movement is no longer just an undercurrent, as in the bourgeois revolutions of the 19th century, but has grown into a great current that dominates and sweeps away everything else. As a result of the initial victory and the subsequent stagnation and backflow of revolutionary development, the only truly consistent and ruthlessly revolutionary class, the Russian, and with it the entire international proletariat, is ultimately faced with this contradiction. As a result of the initial victory and subsequent stagnation and backflow of revolutionary development, the only truly consistent and ruthlessly revolutionary class, the Russian and with it the entire international proletariat, is ultimately faced with this contradiction, and it is precisely the great historical advance that this revolution was no longer just fought for by the proletarian class in practice, but was also carried out under its own slogans that now make the real class-based revolutionary solution to this contradiction that has arisen all the more difficult and painful for this proletariat. In all previous revolutions, this, quote, revolutionary solution occurred in such a way that, in the further course of development, the classes that had initially been united against the old state power were inevitably pushed against one another in a second battle, in which the proletarian class was regularly defeated, but through which, however, and precisely through these defeats of the proletariat, on the one hand, the republic that had emerged from the first period of revolutionary struggle, was separated from the social illusions and socialist concessions initially associated with it, and the bourgeois republic was officially established as the ruling one. On the other hand, at the same time, the proletarian class itself was inevitably freed from its traditional illusions about the character of this republic and was brought face to face with the future real enemy, the future real class enemy, the bourgeoisie. All attempts to apply this same pattern to the development of the class struggle in Soviet Russia over the last 10 years are doomed to failure. Certainly, even in the 10 years that have passed since Red October 1917, every significant section of the revolutionary annals bears the heading, quote, defeat of the proletariat. Just as the revolutionary proletarian state suffered its first external defeat in the very first stage of its existence in the Peace of Brest-Litovsk imposed on it, So at the same time, the Russian proletariat also suffered its first defeat as a class, at the hands of an enemy whose nature was still unclear at the time, so to speak, at the birth of the proletarian dictatorship. This first-class defeat of the Russian proletariat was expressed politically in the failed attempts of those who, under the slogan of, quote, democratic centralism, sought to counter the centralist party dictatorship that had been gaining ground in the new Soviet state from the very beginning with a real class dictatorship, a real council dictatorship. The first-class defeat of the Russian proletariat was expressed politically in the failed attempts of those who, under the slogan of, quote, democratic centralism, sought to counter the centralist party dictatorship that had been gaining ground in the new Soviet state from the very beginning with a real class dictatorship, a real council dictatorship. Parenthesis, the main leaders of the then group of, quote, democratic centralism, comrades Smirnov, Sopronov, and others, today again form the, quote, most left wing within the left opposition groups rebelling against the Stalinist party and state regime, the one that most sharply and boldly expresses the class demands of the Russian proletariat. There's some good pieces on here. I think the one's by Michel Olivier, I think it's his name, but he has a really good stuff on the early oppositions within the Bolshevik Party. Check out the other pieces also by Robert V. Daniels on this channel. Back to the text. The first class defeat of the Russian proletariat was then followed in the further development by an almost unbroken chain of further defeats. The first in 1920/21, defeat of the so-called, quote, workers' opposition of Shliapnikov and the Kronstadt uprising. The second, 1923/24, parenthesis, successful, quote, Leninist conspiracy of Stalin, Zinoviev, and their extra Russian satellites Maslow and Ruth Fischer in Germany, Suzanne Girard in France, etc., against the so-called, quote, Trotskyism, i.e. against the attempt made by Trotsky at that time, together with the old opposition group of, quote, democratic centralism, and various other opposition groups supported by Myasnikov's, quote, workers' group, to reopen the class question in the Russia of the NEP, defeat and capitulation of Trotsky, abandonment of Myasnikov by Trotsky, in parentheses. The third, now in 1926-27, parentheses, repeated capitulation of the leaders of the, quote, left opposition bloc, retreat of Trotsky and Zinoviev before a ruthless raising of the only real and decisive question, the class question of the Russian and international proletariat, restriction of the, quote, opposition within the framework of Soviet Russian, quote, state necessities, actual abandonment of the, quote, leftists who want to put the class question on the agenda in full earthly life size, in parentheses. I have works by Myasnikov, including a piece called The Latest Deception on this channel. Where am I? Some footnotes I want to check out. Footnote. T.P. Sopronov lived from 1887 to 1939. Bolshevik since 1910. Head of the opposition group Democratic Centralists, 1919 to 19... it's a typo. It says 1919 and 1910, but I'm assuming it says 1919 to 1920. Signatory of the Opposition Declaration of the 46 in 1923. Leading member of the left opposition, expelled from the party in 1927, banished in 1928. Vladimir Smirnov, Bolshevik since 1904, spokesperson for the, quote, military opposition at the 8th Party Congress in 1919, was a member of the group Democratic Centralists in 1919 to 1920, signatory of the Declaration of the 46, 1923, expelled from the party with the left opposition in 1927. The group, quote, Democratic Centralists, was formed in 1919 on the left wing of the party. The Democratic Centralists opposed the bureaucratic excesses of the party leadership. In addition to T.V. Sopronov and V. Smirnov, the group included N. Osinsky, V.N. Maximovsky, A.S. Bubnov, M.A. Raphael, M.S. Boguslavsky, K.K. Urenev, among others, mainly members of the party intelligentsia, the first 5 of whom had already been among the, quote, left communists of 1918. The group advocated extreme decentralism and was condemned at the 11th Party Congress of the Russian in the 11th Congress of the Russian Communist Party in 1920. I don't think that should be the 9th or something like that. Osinsky, T.V. Sopronov, V.I. Smirnov, V.N. Maximovsky, A. Bubnov, and others were among the signatories of the Declaration of the 46 in 1923. In 1927, the group around Sopronov and V.M. Smirnov appeared as the, quote, left opposition. Korsch had their platform before him at that time. Before Thermidor, revolution and counter-revolution in Soviet Russia, the platform of the left opposition in the Bolshevik Party. Edited by the Hamburg October Fighters who were expelled from the Communist Party, Hamburg, 1927. End footnote. Footnote. A.G. Shliapnikov, 1885 to 1937. In 1920, leader of the workers' opposition with Alexander Kollontai and Medvedev. In the, quote, trade union debate, Shliapnikov advocated the thesis of autonomous management of industry by the trade unions, and in 1921 criticized the new economic policy as, quote, anti-worker, capitulated in 1926. In 1933, Shliapnikov was expelled from the party, and in 1937 became victim of Stalinist, quote, purges. End footnote. Footnote. This refers to the Declaration of the 46th to the Politburo of the Central Committee of the Russian Communist Party in Workers' Democracy or Party Dictatorship, published 1967 in Germany. On the question of Trotsky's collaboration with this group and their common defeat, see the account by Isaac Deutscher, Trotsky, Volume 2, The Prophet Unarmed, 1921 to 1929, published in Germany in 1962. G.I. Myasnikov, close to the workers' opposition, followed the principle of tolerance towards non-communists. Expelled from the party in 1922 as a prominent member. Leader of the, quote, workers' group. And footnote. Footnote. Trotsky and Zinoviev submitted a proposal for an armistice to the Politburo on the 4th of October 1926. Stalin withdrew the threat of expulsion but dictated the conditions. End footnote. But none of these internal, quote, defeats of the Russian proletariat in the further development of the Soviet Russian community created by the victorious October represents the sharp turning point that the defeat of the Prussian proletariat in the class battle of June 22nd, once represented in the Revolution of 1848 described by Marx. The Russian proletariat, on the one hand, through the revolution it brought about itself and under its own slogans, is bound to be the product of its revolution, its revolutionary dictatorship, in a completely different way than could ever have been the case with those earlier proletarian undercurrents of bourgeois revolutions, and, on the other hand, has remained alone on a world scale since 1921, and is in reality far too weak in number and specific weight in the new economic and political Soviet Russian community compared to the other classes, has never been in a position to stand up for its demands in an open battle so as to force the new revolutionary state, the quote the quote socialist Soviet Republic, end quote, to emerge in its true form, or as a mere new form of the bourgeois state, whose admitted purpose is to perpetuate the rule of capital, the slavery of labor, and at the same time to constitute itself as a revolutionary class also in relation to this new state. One second. This also solves the riddle that initially seems insoluble to many, quote, left-leaning workers in Western Europe and Russia. Why did the glorious proletarian revolution of the Red October of 1917 ultimately result in something so completely different? For simple, abstract, and undialectical thinking, it seems an insoluble contradiction if, in the same breath, we praise the proletarian revolution of the Red October and describe its historical result, the present-day Soviet state, as a new capitalist class state, which, from the point of view of the proletariat, already today, 10 years after the Red October of 1917, differs from the old capitalist states only in form, but no longer in content. And to, quote, solve this contradiction, most people are looking for some kind of, quote, original sin, parenthesis, and some find it in the Brest Peace of 1917, others in the transition to the new economic policy in 1921, others in the degeneration of the Russian party, quote, since Lenin's death in 1924, others only in the transition from the new economic policy to the neo-NEP in 1925, etc., so that from a certain date onwards they can register the, quote, collapse of the proletarian dictatorship, end quote, and the, quote, transformation of the revolutionary worker state into a bourgeois class state, end quote, as an accomplished fact. The Stalinists could rightly reply that such an, quote, original sin, such an absolutely decisive break with the previous economy and politics of the entire history of the Soviet state and its ruling party, cannot be found at all. And if in this 10-year period one particular point in time than any other appears to be the turning point from the progressive and increasing to the receding and ebbing development of the Russian October Revolution, namely the turning point of 1921. This change is in fact much less a change of course, which occurred specifically in Russia, in the internal development of the Russian October Revolution and the new Russian Soviet state, than a change in the entire economic and hence also the entire political situation which occurred at that time in connection with the great world economic crisis and its beginning overcoming on a world scale. It is precisely here that the true nature of the development of the new Soviet Russian community in the period after October 1917 becomes particularly clear as a continuing class struggle not only on a Russian but also and above all on an international scale. It is precisely here that the true nature of the development of the new Soviet Russian community in the period after October 1917 becomes particularly clear as a continuing class struggle, not only on a Russian, but also, and above all, on an international scale. In reality, the bourgeois counter-revolution in the new Russia begins at the time of the Proletarian Revolution. The entire historical period following the victorious October 1917 is filled, on a Russian as well as international scale, with these uninterrupted struggles between the various social classes and class fractions that developed as a result of the pre-war and war developments in Russia, and on an international scale, and thus formed the starting point for both the Russian October Revolution of 1917 and for the general world revolutionary movement in the immediate post-war period of 1918 to 1920. But if the proletariat did not initially emerge victorious from these struggles, here, either in Russia or on an international scale, this cannot be attributed solely to the class balance of power that already existed at the outbreak of these revolutionary struggles in the period of 1917 to 1920, and that was found by the revolutionary movement. What was decisive was rather the change in the economic situation itself, which had occurred in the meantime, especially since 1921, and the resulting change in the balance of forces with which those various classes and class fractions had originally entered the revolutionary movement, thus ultimately a far-reaching upheaval in the fundamental conditions under which the entire international, and thus also the Russian proletariat, had to wage its struggles in the new period now beginning. That sentence was all in italics, so I'm going to read it again. What was decisive was rather the change in the economic situation itself, which had occurred in the meantime, especially since 1921, and the resulting change in the balance of forces with which those various classes and class fractions had originally entered the revolutionary movement, thus ultimately a far-reaching upheaval in the fundamental conditions under which the entire international, and thus also the Russian proletariat, had to wage its struggles in the new period now beginning. The new defect of the victorious Russian working class, defeat. The new defeat of the victorious Russian working class in October 1917, which has been brought about gradually and imperceptibly over a period of 10 years, and which has in fact already been completed today on the 10th anniversary of the, quote, socialist Soviet Union, together with the new serious defeats suffered by the entire international proletariat on a world scale during the same period, are also valid for the sentences which we have set out as a motto for this entire article, and which look far into the future. With these sentences, Karl Marx showed the revolutionary proletariat the way, even after the first great defeat of the proletariat in the French and Pan-European Revolution of 1848, how it can gain new strength for its future struggle from precisely these inevitable defeats, and thus transform the temporary defeat into final victory. Of course, even today, just as 80 years ago, these possibilities shown to the proletariat by Marx of exploiting the defeat of a mature, really revolutionary proletarian class party remain objectively unfulfilled. For this very reason, they have remained subjectively an urgent revolutionary task for us to fulfill in practice. For the joint solution of this common Marxist task, we call out to the Russian class-conscious proletarians and the entire class-conscious vanguard of the proletariat of the whole world today, on the 10th anniversary of Red October 1917, once again the old powerful Marxist slogan, "Proletarians of all countries, unite." That's the end of the article. Thank you so much for listening.